In what way did the post office culture stop the post office from dealing with postmasters in a straightforward and acceptable way?
I think by setting out the belief we referred to earlier that a postmaster was accountable for whatever happened in a post office, I think, yes, there was a logic to it, but it gave post office an excuse in a way not to investigate it, because the burden was on the postmaster rather than post office and post office's financials. And I think one point where I saw that, and it was a genuine moment of being ashamed, is one of the areas I hadn't really looked at was suspensions. And the judge obviously told us that we couldn't that we had to pay people during a period of suspension. And when, he said that, he thought, yeah, no, that must be right. So we started doing that. And a few months later, one of the operational people, told me that, because this was now a cost to post office, the number of suspensions and the duration of the suspensions had fallen.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I am a recovering public servant here on Kaurna land, and joining me today are my two colleagues in recovery, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison.
All right, so Caroline, at the end of our last episode, you described the prosecution's function within Post Office as like a zombie, insofar as a zombie function. It just kept on happening even as the circumstances changed. And you think you have and I quote here from the notes Caroline has written for me, nifty explanation of why these functions just keep going even though they seem absurd. Explain it to us.
I mean, firstly, I would just say nifty is an underused word that we should seek to bring back.
You're on your own there, girl.
Look, No, I'm with you. Thanks, Dee. Look, I've been reading this book by Dan Davies called The Unaccountability Machine, and shout out to friend of the program, Aaron Hill, for putting me onto it. Look, Dan Davies' essential argument is that big organisations operate as automated information processing machines. They take information, they process it to do things with it, make products, deliver services, buy things pretty much regularly and repeatably, notwithstanding the people who come and go inside of it. And look, one thing I like about this way of thinking about organisations is that it looks beyond the individual motivations of people inside it, like are they good people, are they bad people, what are they trying to do? And it says, look, let's view the system as a black box and understand how it operates by looking at what it actually does, not what people say it does. And I think it helps us understand how individuals in line areas who do a small part of a bad thing, write up the audit report that prosecutes an innocent sub-postmaster, recover robo-debts, can keep on doing it despite it being obviously morally horrific in practice. So that's the kind of broader context. One phenomenon that becomes apparent to Dan Davies is this thing called accountability sinks, which I really was quite taken with. They're places where bad outcomes can be parked and not interfere with the overall operation of the system. So that's where policies and procedures act to make it impossible or very, very hard for a human decision maker to intervene and do something different, even if there's lots of unhappy customers on the end. And the example that he gives, which is just so resonant for some of us with emotional regulation issues, is if your flight is cancelled or you are pushed onto a different flight, actually you don't shout at the counter clerk, right? Because she has literally no ability to change that decision. She is just like the person passing through the thing from above, and you have no way of ever reaching the layer of the organisation where that decision or policy was made. You are just subject to the system. And what Dan Davies said is like, sure, fine, maybe it's okay to have these kind of quite automated processes and decision-making when those policies map to the real world pretty well. But when the system encounters outliers and exceptions, like shortfalls in post offices driven by the computer system, not by someone stealing, then the system will keep functioning even though the process starts to look quite absurd because there's no way of kind of getting that information feedback that says, hang on. And I think it helps us get to your point, Alison, at the last episode. You said, why is no one noticing the pattern? Why isn't the system learning? And it's because the feedback, the information loop kind of
just goes
stops.
into one of those accountability sinks and
it goes into an accountability sink. Does that resonate? Do you guys kind of, maybe I didn't explain it well.
No, it does. It resonates. It gives me chills in some ways. And I think that this has to be like, and we'll probably get to it in different parts, but I've got an increasing fascination with AI in the health system and Tony Blair's recent, announcements, which I think is interesting to have done the week that there's another Labor government. I'm like, whoa, how many prime ministers are we doing? But anyway, the AI has this capacity to kind of create 12 billion within a couple of years of savings, £12 billion of public sector workers' wages not required, focusing on criminal justice and planning and transport and healthcare. That's all fine. But we haven't learnt from the original, and when I say learned, not for the sake of learning, we continue to make catastrophic mistakes with the level of technology we had access to before, and we never built the transparency into it, the governance of it. We never built the human stop button. And so that actually made perfect sense, the accountability sink. But what gave me chills was we have to invest really heavily and really quickly in counterweighting accountability sinks. Like, everyone's rushing off to how do I use data for storytelling? So the training is all around AI and using data and data for decision making. And there's nothing wrong with all of that. I think the question is, that's fine. Where is the other emerging crowd of thinkers around accountability sink and judgment and the stop button?
Exceptions.
And I don't mean not woo-woo. I don't mean high-level governance of AI. I mean who on the shift in the hospital has the power to turn it off when any critical thinker with context realises that something has gone wrong. So anyway.
Because it's taken us ages.
I think that will continue. I think it'll keep coming up.
It's taken us ages to build those systems in, there's a term for it, which I honestly can't remember now, just safety culture, something like that. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, where we've empowered gradually junior aircraft people and nurses and other people who were stopped from saying there's something that's about to go wrong because of the hierarchy of the situation that they were in. Yeah, wrong leg, not that one. And done all this work to kind of build up their ability to say, woo, stop. You said nifty, I said woo, so just becoming a boomer here. But when it's built into an IT system, what we're getting from Post Office and from Robodebt is there's no one that can say that's wrong because it's infallible. It's the computer.
And I don't want that to stop us because I personally think we just keep all the public servants. I just think they've got some other things they could be doing if we could free up the AI. So I have a different view around to Tony Blair, but equally, I don't want that fear to stop us. I think there's still, I can see huge opportunity, and then I can see huge opportunity for freeing up resources to do other important things. I just think all of it has to come. Every step forward needs to come with like a corresponding set of transparency, governance, stop buttons.
Yep. So I think,
and not stop forever, just stop right now, because I'm a human and I can contextually put it together.
To Neil Collins pressing stop on the letters going out before Christmas, like everyone needs to have that stop button.
Yeah,
absolutely. So look, if we think about poll as like So not just Horizon, but POL itself as a giant information processing system.
POL?
So it's a computer run by people. Post Office Limited, sorry.
Radio.
If we think about, you can tell I'm down the nerd hole. If we think about it as a giant information processing system, I think we can begin to see why these prosecutions keep happening. So here, the information signal at the beginning is the discrepancy in the balance at the branch, right? Like there's something going wrong. And that information could go lots of places, like it goes to the call centres round and round, it might get picked up, it might get fixed. It goes to the boss, they send it to the regional contract manager, the sub-postmaster says, hey, I'm having this problem. And that person, especially in the early days, might actually try and help the person fix it. Or they might do what we talked about yesterday, which is call in the auditors and then suspend the person and investigate and prosecute them, right? So what happens then is, so we've got this piece of information, something's going wrong, it is then channeled into this place where the auditors, investigators do the thing. Now, what do? Their job is not to find out what has gone wrong. Let's be clear. Their job is to find human error and investigate fraud. They're investigators, right? They're not the IT team, they're investigators.
If you're a hammer, everything's a nail.
Exactly right. So functionally, what this team acts as is a dead end on the feedback loop that says the system isn't working. So what we'll see is this feedback of something's gone wrong in my post office doesn't go anywhere else anymore. It now goes here. It is no longer information to which the organisation has to respond. It's been shunted off, and there's two places it can go now. Either the investigators find and solve the problem, we found the 30 coupons that you dropped on the floor under the branch and we've whatever, or we're going to prosecute you for theft and we'll recover it from you when we sell your house. So let's just have a listen to one of the investigators reflect on this to the inquiry.
Your investigation reports aimed effectively at building the case, or were there some cases where in your investigation report you said, I don't think criminal charges should be brought?
I'm sure, I'm going to say there was a number of cases we would deal with. I'm going to say it could be something like missing vouchers or whatever, so there could be something that's gone up to our admin department and they've opened up and things are missing, and you might go there and you might find the vouchers or whatever at the branch. You still write it up, but not to the criminal law team. You just write it up to the casework team saying there's no evidence of criminality, something like that. But for significant audit shortages or pension allowance fraud, then I think that they would probably all go up to the criminal law team, but they may advise no further action, but I can't recall any specific ones, no.
So this is fascinating because there's no option to get that information back into the wider information ecosystem. Exactly
right. And what we know is if there was an option to get it back into either Fujitsu or into regional branch management or whatever, things would change. And how do we know it? Well, in the grab up the top that we played, we hear from Alastair Cameron, not that one, a different one, the CFO of Post Office, Alastair Cameron, who is, I think, he's the only truly reflective witness you hear from in the Post Office inquiry from Post Office, so worth a listen. And what he says is that the practice of suspending postmasters without pay when a discrepancy is discovered stopped overnight when Post Office was made to pay people when they were suspended. So without isn't it right? So without a feedback loop that made them accountable for the impact of sending people off to investigation and prosecution, there was no imperative for the system to change. But literally once it was like a money thing from your budget, I have to pay them while they're suspended, they stopped doing it.
Yep.
Very motivated at that point.
Yep.
Isn't it terrible?
Terrible, but
also it's the information input kind of coming back in insofar as it now costs you money. So it's not a thing that was over there being dealt with by the audit/investigations team that you never needed to think about anymore from head office.
Exactly.
It's now bubbled back up to being your problem.
It is a feedback loop. You have reinserted a feedback loop. Similarly,
this is fascinating.
I know this is so going to appeal to you, Alison. This is like your thing. Sorry,
I've got other issues, which is the nature of this is you can call them investigators, but they're regulators, right? And they are regulators in some ways because they're they have that same, I have a single job and I have a set of rules to apply.
Yes.
And I'm not here to think about ICT or policy or customers or integrity or like the long list of things a generalist would have to consider is not of their kind of remit. They have a single set of functions, and I suspect were trained to a single set of functions instead of trained to any kind of breadth or context or connecting the dots. And I think we do see this kind of thing that is really concerning, where we are zoned in on one particular element instead of stepping back and connecting any of the other parts to it. Like the idea that you could investigate a computer fraud, an ICT fraud, we're going back to calling it a computer and really aging ourselves, an ICT-based fraud without ICT skills. So if you rely on having to call Fujitsu and them say, it's fine, instead of having any skills, basic or otherwise, to be able to prosecute that information yourself, is a very narrow funnel with which you can only often get one answer.
Indeed. And that is, I think, the value of this analysis is understanding, there's some great acronym which is like the purpose of the system is what it does, POSIWID, right? Like the purpose of the investigations team is what it does, it investigates. And if you understand that, you stop viewing it through a moral lens and you start understanding that as leaders, when we're putting together our systems, we really need to understand what are the things they're doing, not kind of what do we expect people to do outside of their function, like what are the exceptional things we expect them to do. And look, similarly for Fujitsu, when they're servicing Post Office, their function is not necessarily to get to the bottom of every individual thing that's going wrong. Their function is to maintain the serviceability of the system at the minimum amount of cost, right? And so serviceability
Sorry,
for
quality where? What was
serviceability. Serviceability is quality, right?
Yeah. It doesn't need to be 100% of the time.
Yeah.
It needs to be mostly fine most of the time.
Exactly right. And you could spend £1 billion trying to get 99.999 and that would not be a good use of money. So they are just writing to the contract. They're like, right.
Yep.
And the information signal for them comes from Post Office, not from the sub-postmasters, because Post Office pays their wages. So this will hit on something that you will love, Dee. Jan Holmes, the former audit manager at Fujitsu, provides evidence to the inquiry that the Horizon Help Desk doesn't chase down problems, but instead offers a reboot in 9 out of 10 situations. Can you imagine calling a help desk?
Yes, of course I can.
90% of the time, can you turn it off and on? Yeah. Yes, because the service level agreement was written to prioritise getting branches up and running again in a certain amount of time, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, rather than resolving the underlying issues. And the reboot got it running even if you didn't solve the problem.
Yeah, because service level agreements are usually written to time, because the thing that you are complaining about as a user of a service is usually, I've been waiting for my payroll update, whatever, for ages and ages. And so they build them based on what you're going to complain about. What you very rarely complain about, because it's harder to quantify, is in some ways not quality or correctness, but so there's something in there where the service level agreements are about the KPIs in them are all built around what is going to bug you the most. And what's going to bug you the most is when you rely on another part of the business or an external to deliver something for you and it slows you down. I can't finish because I haven't got my widget and I haven't got my whatever. And so that's what's going to bug you, and that's what you're going to complain about. So that's what the metric is. The metric is very rarely doing kind of big audits of whether the work was any good.
Root cause analysis. Well, I was thinking, Dee, about like how annoyed you are when complaints metrics are closing out the complaint. And like I just think that is the same thing that's happening here. Like the metric is close the complaint, keep people moving, not
need for speed.
Yeah, exactly. And so we hear similar evidence from Anne Chambers from Fujitsu, who wrote a paper in 2007. So this is a contemporaneous document, which is I think always, evidentially more interesting. This is not her looking back at it and saying, now I see it. 2007, she wrote this paper about the lack of incentives for Fujitsu to chase things down because Post Office wasn't pushing them. And she's asked about it at the inquiry, and I'm going to play it now, even though it's quite long, because I think it really captures this question of what's driving the decision-making.
You say that it leads to too many calls being closed without proper investigation or resolution. Why did it lead to calls being closed without proper investigation?
Because the help desk were just bouncing them back without it coming to SSC. And there probably were cases where there was a system error that did need to be picked up on. And obviously in that case, the sooner it came to SSC, the better.
And so that would just be bounced back. And if the postmaster wasn't persistent,
that did happen, yes.
It would just be closed off.
Yes, that did happen.
And what would happen to if there was a loss? They just have to pay up?
If they couldn't find the reason for the loss as a business issue.
And you say it's possibly not an issue of concern to the Post Office. Why didn't you think the Post Office was possibly not really concerned about this?
I think by this point I had realised that the outcome for the postmasters was not Post Office's primary consideration.
What was the Post Office's primary consideration?
I think by this point it was fairly clear that they were keen on defending the integrity of their system rather than trying to get to the bottom of issues, whether system problems or business problems affecting individual branches. When I started working on Horizon, I didn't appreciate the fact that the sub-postmasters really didn't work for Post Office, but they were a third party in all this. Any other systems I'd ever worked on, if there was a problem and I said, well, I can't see anything wrong on the system side, then the customer, if they continue to have problems, would push back quite strongly and say, but look, this isn't right, we need to sort it, and then we would work together to sort it out. But with the case of Post Office, and it took me quite a long time to realise how it worked, the postmasters they didn't have the power to do the pushing back. And our client, Post Office, who would have had that power, did not seem interested in doing that.
Yeah, and the only people that could have pushed were the sub-postmasters, and they were disconnected from Fujitsu.
Yeah, but they also had a stamp on their head as criminals at this point, by the time it really kicks off.
Thieves.
So again, you see an ending of an information loop, right? So Fujitsu has a way of taking this information, which is broken branch, something discrepancy, and they can spit out an easy answer, the answer we talked about last week. Well, the help desk didn't look like there was anything wrong, or they can give these very narrow things that say nothing's wrong. And there's no prod to make them do the broader answer. So again, that complaint just goes into the ether. Like it just kind of blocks at that point. And then similarly, the purpose of the outsourced legal firm is to conduct prosecutions, and that's like a nice little dead end. So it goes off to there, and they win most of them, and when they don't win them, they don't do any review, and that's quite interesting as well. So what I find really interesting about this is that over this so from about 2000 to 2013, when they halt prosecutions, the context of the organisation changes enormously. Like Post Office breaks out from Royal Mail, so they actually, the legal team changes completely. They have this huge period of austerity where they stop doing in-house prosecutions, they do it to the outsourced people.
Was that cheaper?
No, it wasn't, and they say that. You
just
love it.
Asking.
It was because someone was very conscious that the board looked at headcount, and they say that in the evidence.
FTE obsession.
The Royal Mail, when Post Office and Royal Mail separate, Pol has to set up its own central kind of HR and everything functions, and its own investigation function and its own criminal law function, and they get the worst lawyer, like in the great, it's like the reverse Mog, right? You know, it's like, who is the worst person? They leave.
The bring out your dead.
Jarnail Singh, he is like...
Don't look too excited to move this person. Pretend like it's a hardship. Don't look like you're excited, or the other part of this Mog might realise.
Well, they'll know.
Exactly right. At the same time, the nature of the network contract changes, and in fact, sub-postmasters, so we have far fewer regional branch managers managing many more sub-postmasters. The back end at Chesterfield, you know, the people counting the pieces of paper, all of these things change, right? And yet prosecutions just keeps its shape and keeps on going. And I think there's really good evidence that the board had, like many of the board members had literally no awareness that they were doing private prosecutions. They knew that people were being prosecuted, but they thought it was like the Crown. There's no one saying you must do it, but very importantly, there's no one saying let's stop doing it. And that's because it's performing a really important organisational function, right? It is the terminus point of these things that could otherwise be quite complicated.
Yes, the accountability sink.
Exactly right. It is stopping all that inconvenient information from getting anywhere. So let's imagine a different system, right? One where a sub-postmaster says something wrong and Fujitsu can't close it out until the sub-postmaster is satisfied that it's resolved, or there's positive proof that the sub-postmaster is wrong about the issue. In that context, the information can't be lost, right?
Radical, Caroline. Radical. But yeah, continue.
So in that context, you'd see no prosecutions without positive proof, right? Because the information, it can't just go to Fujitsu and they say everything's okay. Like there's a little loop that can't close. The information has to come back to the investigators. And we'd see Horizon problems get surfaced and fixed. Now that is like, I get it, utopia. But there is a fascinating real-world counterfactual, and it goes back to something Danielle said right at the beginning of the last episode about how would we deal with these people if they were public servants. Because, in fact, Post Office did run its own post offices as well, Crown offices. And mostly, these were not affected by Horizon issues, it seems. And, in fact, people give evidence. They say, look, it just didn't seem like there was this same problem with Horizon in these Crown offices.
How is that possible?
Do we think the computer system was more reliable there?
It's not usually how they work, but, you know.
Yeah. So, two things. One, they wrote off discrepancies in Crown offices instead of prosecuting for them. Crazy idea. Because two, as one of the union reps said to the inquiry, we would never have stood for employees being treated this way.
Yep.
So in this case, there is also an information dead end, right? The information dead end that Horizon isn't doing the right thing still just goes into this place where they write it off, right? So it doesn't get it fixed. But at least no one goes to jail.
Look.
And at least there's a recognition that would be an appalling way to treat people.
Crazy. Absolutely crazy.
That really affirms your point, though, Danny.
It does affirm my point. It would have also. Can you imagine the amount? Like, I have actually spent a little bit of time looking at the UK Public Service in the last month, and it has many similarities that are met to Australia, but also the amount of resources would have been required for the process for £400.
Yes,
wouldn't have been in their own best interests, whereas. So much easier as a subcontractor. So you effectively have two completely different classes of effectively employees. One's not an employee, but doing a very similar job. Mm-hmm. But doesn't this just get back to the same thing we keep coming back to, which is, you said, Caroline, the board had no idea. No idea anyone had been prosecuted. So what did they see when they saw metrics? What kind of complaint data did they see? If you're rolling out, and from memory, the cost of it goes up in a shocking development. But the board, I assume, would have had controls of like this major ICT rollout has cost this much, it's now going to cost this much. It does this, it does that. Mm-hmm. The board and senior leadership don't seem to have thought through the customer and sub-postmaster part of it, of like, what information do I want? How do I know this is working properly, and what kind of data do we have so that I can see systems and patterns? It seems like a very passive, what can the computer do, not what the computer is doing kind of.
Or just even more, like I just think this was not, when they asked the board members, well, did you ask these questions? They're like, that's very operational. It's kind of like asking, like, you know, I don't know, how many people have green shoes? Like, you know.
Sure, operational until you reversed the onus of proof and found yourself in the largest legal scandal going around for a while. Like, again, operational is often sniffed at, and boards should be governance led, but I would have thought legal risk, for instance, very much in the ballpark of a board.
But there's no risk when they look at it, because remember, there's no feedback loop. Yep. What's happening is they're getting a range of successful prosecutions, mostly. And so they're like, well, the system's working. We're catching all these thieves and they're going to jail.
But again, that's because of the information they're receiving or not receiving. Yeah. And what's in it.
And I think this is where I find the Dan Davies analysis particularly interesting.
Yeah, because it all just disappears.
That's right. And so one of the things he says, and I'm interested, Alison might think about this in her airline crash context as well, is he says that organisations beset with scandals have often come out of the back of a thinning out of the ranks of middle management. Because he says, both in terms of numbers, but actually also in terms of expertise, like a replacement of like an expert core of middle managers who actually know the business with, like, you know, people like us who don't know anything. And he says what this has the effect of is of removing a key way in which information is passed from the front line to the top, which is about the judgment, right? So it's like, because all the information looked fine, you know, X people prosecuted all successfully, it all looks fine. But the judgment of middle managers to say, well, it's a bit weird that all these respectable people that we recruited to be post officers and who've been working for us for 20 years have suddenly all started stealing money. That's what
stealing from us.
That's right. So I found that super fascinating.
I just also, like, I just feel like even for these accountability sinks, there should be some, like, the sink is full of water and it's about to overflow warning, right? Of like at some point there has to have been a significant percentage change here, right? A significant percentage change in the amount of prosecutions that were being undertaken, or for Robodebt, the amount of appeals that were being taken to the AAT, and that should in some way, somewhere, for someone, trigger the notion that there's something worth looking at here, that you don't go from prosecuting 10 people a year to 1,000 people a year without there being something that changed.
But don't we get back to those assumptions, though, like the assumptions that we're now catching previously undetected fraudulent welfare recipients and previously...
So they see the trigger and they ignore it because they think the previous data was wrong.
But equally.
And
but the junior people, like the people in the individual line areas, that's the story they tell themselves. And they're asked this by the inquiry, and that's literally the story they say. They're like, I saw a lot of fraud beforehand, I saw more fraud afterwards, I thought the system was more rigorous and we were catching more fraud. And this is why sort of pulling out from like individual people's mindsets and thinking about the information loop, that's what's so fascinating, is the information loop just gets stuck there, right? Like all of that information, no one's pulling it together. So, of course, who pulls it together? Actually, the sub-postmasters and the MPs that they go to become the campaign. And, like, it has to become this whole other thing because the internal organisation has no way of bringing it back in.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm thinking a lot now about dead information loops and where they are. And where we find them and how we find them.
And how many of them are designed that way and how many of them are by accident.
So I would just say on the
Not in this one. I'm not saying in post office necessarily. I'm just saying that if you really want to find something out as a leader, you can find it out.
Of course.
So you can either design the system so that the alarm goes off when the sink is full. Torture this analogy now. Or you don't, and then there's a question of like leadership culture and them and that leadership culture of what I want to know versus what I don't want to know. I don't care whether we've got more sickies at the moment, but I do care about X, Y, Z. Like some of it comes down to leadership culture and what you want to know, and then you often design the accountability sink in the direction of what they want to know.
So the functioning of the accountability sink is like a rigid application of policies and processes, or a kind of automaticness that doesn't let a human intervene, right? Like if you think about that's what's happening and that's why the information dies there. I think there's something, it's worth remembering that we choose policies and processes. And I've done this. I've been like, well, we should just write down a policy and process and get most people to run it, because arbitrary human judgment is also pretty problematic. Like it's pretty racist, it's pretty sexist, it's pretty anti-class, like it's like all the things. So we have policies and processes.
Judges make worse decisions when they're hungry.
Oh, I mean, I make terrible decisions when that exactly this. So,
but there's data for it anyway.
Well, how do they quantify? Anyway, so
before lunch, after lunch.
I love it. But no, I was trying to work out how they quantify the quality of decision. Like, how do you know what's a good decision? Oh, what's appealed and what's wins, I guess. Anyway,
what's appealed? Yeah, I think so.
So I think it's worth remembering that there probably are deliberate choices built into these things, but they're not always like avoidant choices. They're different kinds of choices. And we might finish by listening to Paul Inwood, a former post office executive, one of the chippiest of the inquiry. See, that's another word we need to bring back. He's very chippy. Who describes essentially this thing.
Chipper?
No, chippy, like chip on his shoulder, like he's super hostile and chippy kind of.
A chippy builds decks, mate. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, he's sort of sparky. He's got it. Anyway, one of the most kind of just persistently like a burr in your saddle kind of witnesses. He's a real a-hole is I guess what I'm saying. Anyway, he uses the language weak for an organisation that has inbuilt discretion and strong for an organisation that follows process. And so let's just have a little listen to that.
I'd like to look at the culture of the post office. Can you assist us with that, what seems to be described as some sort of culture shift?
I think I'm referring back to a period of time where every postmaster would have a direct relationship with an area manager, and all the branches were account managed. And I think for many postmasters then, the relationship was a lot closer, and they were receiving a lot more direct face-to-face support. And when I started off as an area manager in the 90s, I think you often used to see or hear about cases where a postmaster had requested a shortage to be written off. And I think there was probably more leniency in that period of time. And I think the change happened because of business efficiency. Far fewer postmasters had that direct face-to-face relationship with postmasters, and they were more reliant on the helpline.
You describe it here as a culture of weak management. That's a term that you used in 2009. Did the post office, as at 2009, see the former approach as a culture of weak management?
I'm not sure that the post office did. That was just my opinion of how things were at the time. There were just decisions made in terms of writing things off that perhaps the losses weren't properly evidenced why that had happened. It was probably a more sympathetic culture.
What I'd like to understand is how it is that a change from somebody who knows a sub-postmaster to somebody who doesn't know a sub-postmaster is interpreted as the former being effectively weak and the latter being strong.
I think there were examples of what I've described there as weak behaviours, i.e. not sticking to agreed policies and processes. Well, I think when it moved to a more central relationship, the operators of helplines stuck rigidly to policies and processes.
and you say they stuck rigidly. Was that at the request of those who were in charge of the policies and procedures?
I think it was just an outcome of an organisational change where people who were like tier 1 helpline operators had less. They didn't have management discretion. They were helpline operators trying to do their best, sticking to scripts and processes. Whereas area managers back in the 90s, I think, had more leeway and management discretion, control of their own budgets to do certain things.
I literally feel like I have had staff members say this about me. I feel that there were examples of what I've described as weak behaviours, i.e. not sticking to agreed policies and processes.
Exactly that, right? And so, Alison, when you don't stick to agreed policies and processes, what are you doing?
I'm applying judgment based on the facts before me.
So, anyway, I really just wanted to finish with that because I just think it's like an interesting dynamic and tension to think about that balance between just following the process and then how you insert human judgment and what kind of organisation you are when you do that.
And, yeah, to go back to that earlier point about middle managers, the role of those middle managers is often in exercising that judgment. And if you've lost and automated that, where does it come from?
And also
de-skilled it.
De-skilled it. And also then also the jobs become less fulfilling because all you're doing is telling people when they can have a day off and telling them that they were slower yesterday at this and that. And if you lose the capacity for content human judgment, then management roles also become dull as dishwater if there is no content in them at all.
Oh, that is so true.
Such a good point. Wow. All right, this has given me lots to think about. I'm going to go for a walk and find information dead ends. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.